When my son chose his wife over me, I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even argue. I just stood there, holding my breath, smiling in a way that didn't feel real. That smile stayed on my face long after my heart quietly broke. It happened on a normal evening. The house was calm, the lights were warm, and the air felt heavy in a way I couldn't explain. I had just finished clearing the dinner table, listening to the soft sound of plates touching the sink. Everything looked the same, but something inside me knew it was. My son stood near the doorway, not looking at me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rude. He just sounded tired, like someone who had already made a decision before speaking. And sometimes, that hurts more than shouting ever could. He said he needed to talk. Those words always feel heavier when they come from your child. I wiped my hands on a towel and turned toward him slowly, as if moving too fast might change what was coming. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself to listen. He spoke about his wife. About their life. About boundaries and space and how things needed to change. His voice was steady, but his eyes avoided mine, like he was afraid of what he might see there. He didn't say he was choosing her over me, not in those exact words, but I felt it anyway, settling quietly into my chest. Sometimes, you don't need words to understand what's being taken away. I nodded as he spoke. I told him I understood. I even told him it was okay. Because when you're a mother, you learn early that loving your child often means stepping back without being asked. That night, I sat alone in my room with the door slightly open. I listened to the house breathe without me, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of laughter that no longer included my name, and I wondered when exactly I became someone who needed permission to belong. I replayed his words again and again. Not because they were harsh, but because they were final. There was no room left for questions, only acceptance. And acceptance can feel very lonely when it comes too soon. I thought about all the years before this moment, the mornings when I woke before sunrise, the nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home safely. The small sacrifices that never felt like sacrifices at the time. I remembered tying his shoes with hands that were always tired, but never complained. I remembered sitting by his bed when he was sick, whispering comfort into the dark. I remembered every version of him before this one. And I wondered how I became someone standing on the outside of his life. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind stayed busy with questions I didn't want answers to. Was I too much? Was I not enough? Or was this just the quiet way life moves us aside? I didn't blame his wife. Not then, not even later. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't about choosing one person over another. It was about change, and my heart wasn't ready for it. I stayed silent for many days after that. Silence can feel safer when words might reveal too much pain. I went about my routine, pretending everything was normal. Because sometimes pretending is the only way to keep standing. But late at night, when the house was asleep, I allowed myself to feel it. The loss, the confusion, the quiet fear of being forgotten. Those were the moments that changed me the most. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning of my misunderstanding. The beginning of a story I thought I already understood, and the beginning of a lesson that would take me much longer to learn. At that time, I believed one thing very clearly. I believed my son had chosen his wife over me, and I believed I was the one left behind. I was wrong. Before everything changed, my life was simple in ways I never questioned. I didn't ask for much. I didn't expect perfection. All I wanted was to feel needed, even in small ways. And for a long time, I did. My son was my world long before he became anyone else's husband. I raised him with the quiet belief that love grows when it is given freely. I never kept count of the nights I stayed awake or the dreams I set aside. At the time, it never felt like sacrifice. It felt like purpose. Our home was not large, but it was warm. It held the sounds of everyday life, footsteps in the hallway, soft music in the evenings, shared meals at a small table. I believed those moments would last forever. I didn't know how quickly forever could change shape. I didn't know how easily a role could fade. When he got married, I told myself I was ready. I smiled in all the photos. I welcomed his wife with an open heart, or at least I believed I did. I reminded myself that this was how life was meant to move forward. She was polite, quiet, careful with her words. At first, I mistook her distance for shyness. I gave her space because I didn't want to seem controlling. I wanted her to feel safe, respected, and free. I kept my advice to myself. I didn't comment on how they ran their home or made their choices. I thought silence was kindness. I thought patience would protect our bond. I didn't realize silence could also create distance. My son slowly changed, but not in obvious ways. He still called. He still visited. But something in his tone felt different, like he was measuring his words. As if he was choosing them carefully, not for honesty, but for peace. Dinner conversations became shorter. Laughter didn't last as long. Sometimes I felt like a guest in my own memories. Present but no longer central. Important but no longer essential. I told myself this was normal. That sons grow up. That mothers must learn to step back. I repeated these thoughts until they felt true, even when my heart resisted them. There were moments when I wanted to speak, to ask if I had done something wrong, to ask if I was still welcome in the same way. But I stayed quiet because I didn't want to become a problem. I believed love meant adjusting. It meant shrinking yourself so others could be comfortable. It meant understanding without explanation. At least, that's what I told myself. Some nights I sat by the window and watched the lights outside. Cars passing. Homes glowing from the inside. I wondered how many other mothers felt this same quiet shift and never spoke about it. I missed the days when my presence felt natural, when I didn't think twice before calling, when my advice wasn't seen as interference. Those days felt distant, like a story I once lived. Still, I held on to hope. Hope that time would soften everything. Hope that love would find its balance again. Hope that I wouldn't always feel like I was standing slightly outside the circle. I didn't know then that small misunderstandings were already forming. That silence was slowly becoming space. That space was turning into distance. And distance into quiet assumptions. At this stage of my life, I truly believed I was doing the right thing. I believed stepping back was love. I believed patience would protect me. And most of all, I believed I understood my place. But understanding, I would later learn, comes in layers. And sometimes, the deepest ones take pain to reveal. The changes did not arrive all at once. They came quietly. So quietly that, at first, I blamed myself for even noticing them. It started with small moments. Moments that didn't seem important enough to talk about. A pause before a reply. A look exchanged between them that I didn't understand. Silence where conversation used to live. When they came over for dinner, I cooked the same way I always had. Nothing fancy. Just warm food made with care. But something felt different at the table. They talked to each other more than they talked to me, not in a rude way, just naturally. As if I was no longer part of the center but sitting slightly off to the side. I listened more than I spoke. I nodded, I smiled. I waited for the right moment to say something meaningful, but the moment never came. Sometimes I would ask simple questions. How was your day? Are you feeling tired? And the answers were short. Kind but brief. Like replies meant to end a conversation, not continue one. I told myself not to read into it. I told myself people change. Life becomes busy. Love matures into quieter forms. Still, my heart noticed what my mind tried to dismiss. There were days when my son used to call just to talk, not about problems, not about plans, just to hear my voice. Now, calls had reasons. Schedules, appointments, quick check-ins. Once during dinner I mentioned something from the past, a small memory, something light. I laughed softly. My daughter-in-law smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. My son looked down at his plate. No one responded. The silence felt heavier than words. I wanted to ask if I had said something wrong. But I didn't. I swallowed the question with my food and kept eating. Another time I offered help, not advice, just help. I can watch the kids if you need rest, I said gently. She replied with a polite smile. We're okay, we've got it. Her voice was calm, but it felt like a door closing very softly. I started choosing my words carefully. I practiced conversations in my head before speaking. I measured my tone. I watched their reactions more than I watched my own feelings. Slowly, I began to feel like a visitor in their life. Welcome but not expected. Allowed but not needed. At night, when the house was quiet, I replayed conversations in my mind. I wondered where I went wrong. I wondered if my presence felt heavy to them. I reminded myself that love means letting go. That motherhood doesn't last forever. That sons belong to their own lives now. But understanding something doesn't stop it from hurting. I noticed that plans were made without asking me. Family decisions discussed later, not before. Information shared after it was already decided. Not intentionally cruel, just excluding. Once I heard my son say, "I'll check with her first," when making a decision. He used to say my name in those moments. It wasn't jealousy I felt. It was replacement. I felt like a chapter that had been read, loved, and quietly closed. During one visit, I stood in the kitchen while they talked in the living room. Their voices were low. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't try to listen. But the distance spoke louder than sound. When I joined them, the conversation stopped. Not suddenly, just naturally. And again, no one noticed. I began to understand that conflict doesn't always arrive as anger. Sometimes it arrives as absence, as being forgotten without intention. I smiled more than usual. I agreed quickly. I apologized even when I didn't know why. Because I believed if I stayed kind enough, quiet enough, small enough, I would keep my place. But places don't stay when they are not claimed. I was still their mother, still family. But slowly, I felt myself fading into the background of their lives. And the most painful part was this: no one was trying to hurt me. They simply didn't see me anymore. Days turned into weeks, and the small silences began to shape the rhythm of our home. It wasn't one big fight or a sharp word that hurt. It was the quiet, the pauses, the things left unsaid. I tried to remind myself that change is natural, that children build their lives in their own way. But every time I entered the living room, I noticed the spaces I no longer filled. The couch had been rearranged. The family photos on the wall were different now. Even the small decorations I had placed with care seemed shifted. Not wrong, just not mine anymore. One evening, I asked my son about a family tradition I had started years ago. "Do we still do this on holidays?" I asked gently. He looked at me, confused for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Not really. I don't think we're doing that anymore." I swallowed the sting of disappointment and nodded. I wanted to argue, to remind him, to insist on the little joys I had held onto for so long. But instead, I smiled and said, "That's okay. Things change." I remember feeling invisible in that moment, not because they didn't love me, but because the roles had shifted and I wasn't prepared for the emptiness it left. Dinner times became exercises in patience. I would pour the food, serve the plates, and sit quietly, listening. Conversations were polite but distant. She spoke first, he followed, and I responded only when necessary. I could feel my presence shrinking, and it frightened me more than any argument could. Sometimes I would try to make light jokes, small comments, stories from the past. They would smile politely, laugh softly, and return to their own exchange. The laughter never reached me. I found myself counting the minutes until I could leave the room without making things awkward. It wasn't anger that made me withdraw. It was hurt, quiet and steady. Hurt that didn't scream but weighed down every movement. There were nights when I lay awake in my own home after visiting theirs. I replayed every word, every glance. Did I say too much? Did I expect too much? Was my love now a burden instead of comfort? One afternoon, I baked cookies like I used to do for them when they were kids. I wanted to share a little warmth, a little memory. She took them with a polite smile, saying, "Thanks." He nodded, barely meeting my eyes. "No, this is wonderful," or "I appreciate this." Just acknowledgement, and my heart ached in silence. I began noticing the small things, the things that once made me feel part of a family. The whispered plans, the shared jokes, the gentle touches on a shoulder, all missing. I could see the life they were building together, a life that included me, technically, but emotionally it felt separate. Sometimes I would speak to them quietly, offering advice, sharing memories, trying to connect. And sometimes they listened. Sometimes they didn't. But even when they did, their eyes betrayed distance. I realized that listening is not the same as caring deeply, and I had been listening, hoping to belong for so long. It wasn't easy to see myself fading like this. I wanted to speak, to confront the cold, the absence, but confrontation would have broken the fragile peace I still held. And peace, even in its emptiness, felt safer than a storm. The tension wasn't loud. It didn't erupt in fights or shouting. It lingered in quiet corners, in passing glances, in the things I no longer said because I feared rejection. I remember one particular morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. They were discussing a vacation, a plan I had once been included in every detail. Now, they barely looked at me as they spoke. I nodded, smiled, and said nothing. I wanted to feel happy for them. But happiness had become complicated. I thought about leaving quietly for a little while, to give them space, or maybe to protect myself from feeling so unseen, but my heart stayed rooted. I was their mother, after all, and love, stubborn and unwavering, does not leave easily. I began keeping my feelings inside, quietly cataloging every hurt and every small kindness. Trying to measure the distance in moments. Trying to understand if this was my fault, or if it was simply life moving forward without me. And then, the moments started growing into patterns. The quiet neglect, the polite distance, the lack of shared smiles, patterns I could no longer ignore. The emotional landscape of my family had shifted, and I was on the edge of being left behind entirely. Yet I did not lose hope. I whispered small prayers to myself, not of religion, but of hope. Hoping they would see me, not just in passing, but truly. Hoping that one day the distance would shrink and love would find a way back into our shared life. Because that is the nature of family. Even when missteps are made, even when hearts falter, even when silence grows too heavy, family has the power to return, to heal, to forgive. But for now, I sat quietly, holding the memories of laughter and warmth, and bracing myself for the next chapter. Knowing the real test of love was patience, and the courage to endure quiet pain. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I first truly felt the shift, the final weight of distance pressing down on me. I had arrived early to the family gathering, just as I always did. The house smelled like freshly baked bread and coffee. Everything looked normal, familiar. Yet as soon as I stepped inside, I sensed the subtle tension. The way eyes flicked away when I entered a room, the way laughter paused for a moment and then resumed without me. I tried to speak with my son, softly, casually. "How are you feeling today?" I asked, smiling. He nodded, said something polite, and returned to her. It wasn't rude, it wasn't meant to hurt. But it hurt all the same. I followed them into the living room, carrying a small tray of snacks. I offered it to them. She smiled, took a piece, and said, almost casually, "Thanks. You can leave the rest on the counter." I paused, my hand frozen midair. I realized then that I wasn't really part of this moment. I wasn't part of the laughter, the conversation, or even the shared food. I was outside looking in. Later, while sitting in the corner, I overheard a conversation they thought I wasn't listening to. She whispered to him, "I think we should do this without her. It'll be easier." He nodded, and something inside me broke quietly, like a small vase shattering in slow motion. The words were gentle, the tone casual, but their meaning was clear. I was not wanted, not needed, not considered. My role as mother, as part of the family unit I had nurtured for years, was slipping away. I felt the tears rise, but I held them back. I could not let them see my pain in that moment. Instead, I focused on my breathing, counting each slow inhale and exhale, grounding myself. Because the world does not stop when your heart breaks. The world continues, indifferent and loud. I remembered every sacrifice I had made, every quiet moment of care and attention, every sleepless night, every word of advice given with love. I remembered how I had always put their happiness before my own. And now, all that care, all those years, seemed to vanish in the space of a single whispered sentence. I left the living room, pretending to water the plants, pretend busy with small chores, all while my heart ached. The betrayal was not dramatic, not explosive. It was quiet. It was the kind that seeps into your bones and leaves you hollow. Later, I returned to the kitchen to find them discussing a trip, one that I had assumed would include me. She casually said, "We thought we'd handle this ourselves." He nodded, no pause, no question, no glance toward me. I realized in that moment that the life I imagined being part of, the family moments I cherished, were no longer mine to share. I sat silently, stirring tea, my hands trembling slightly. I wanted to speak, to explain how much this hurt, to remind them that love is not only about being polite but about inclusion, about care. But I didn't, because words would not reach them then. The quiet pain was mine alone to hold. That night, I walked home slowly, each step heavy with reflection. I asked myself if I had done something wrong. Had I expected too much? Had I misunderstood my place in their hearts? But no clear answer came. Only the undeniable truth that the distance between us had grown into a tangible, almost physical barrier. I sat in my own living room, clutching a small family photo, the edges worn from years of handling. I whispered softly to myself, I did everything I could. I loved, I cared. I was here, and yet being here was no longer enough. For the first time, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, not anger, not despair, but a deep, quiet resignation. The world had shifted, and I could no longer pretend that things were as they once were. This turning point was not marked by shouting or blame or drama. It was marked by silence. The silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. I realized that sometimes love and effort are not enough. Sometimes, even in families, the choices of others carve spaces we cannot fill. And sometimes, the most courageous act is to accept the reality while still holding onto hope. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I had learned in the small moments of quiet betrayal. I understood that the hardest part of love is not losing someone. It is watching them drift, while remaining grounded, loving, and patient. Because even when hearts falter, even when silence grows too heavy, and even when rejection stings, love does not vanish. It waits. It observes. And when the moment is right, it returns. Not for control, not for acknowledgement, but for the simple, quiet truth that families are worth enduring for. A few days later, my son asked me to come over in the evening. His voice was polite, careful, almost rehearsed. I knew, deep inside, that this conversation would change something forever. Still, I went, because a mother always goes. The house felt different that night, not hostile, just distant. The lights were bright, but the warmth was gone. She sat on the couch, hands folded in her lap. My son stood near the window, staring outside, as if gathering courage he didn't know he needed. He cleared his throat. "We've been talking," he said slowly. I nodded, waiting. She spoke next. "We think it would be better if you had your own space." Her tone was calm, reasonable, almost kind. I didn't answer right away. The words settled inside me like cold rain, not sharp, just heavy. My son finally looked at me. "It's not that we don't care," he said. "We just need boundaries." Boundaries. A word I had heard before, but never imagined would be used against me. I wanted to ask when love started needing distance, when care turned into inconvenience. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, not because I was okay, but because I didn't want to make this harder for him. "I understand," I said quietly, and in that moment, something inside him relaxed. As if my acceptance made his choice easier. That realization hurt more than the words themselves. She stood up and walked toward the hallway. "I'll give you some time," she said. Then she left the room. It was just me and my son. I searched his face, hoping to see hesitation. Hope, regret, anything, but he avoided my eyes. I wanted to remind him of the nights I stayed awake waiting for him, the meals I skipped so he could have more, the dreams I set aside so he could chase his, but I didn't. Because love doesn't keep score, and real love doesn't beg. "I'll start looking," I said softly. He nodded. "Thank you for understanding." "Thank you, not I'm sorry, not I love you, just thank you." That night, I went home and opened my closet. I stood there for a long time, staring at clothes I had worn to family dinners, birthdays, quiet evenings. Each piece carried a memory. And suddenly, none of them felt like they belonged anymore. I packed slowly, carefully, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was. Every item I folded felt like a goodbye I wasn't allowed to say out loud. I placed a framed photo on top of the box. Us, smiling, before everything changed. The day I moved out, she stood by the door. Polite, respectful, distant, my son helped carry the bags to the car. He hugged me quickly, like someone hugging a friend, not a mother. "Call us when you get settled," he said. I nodded. As I drove away, I didn't cry. I just breathed, slowly, deeply, because the hardest part wasn't leaving the house. It was realizing that I had already been leaving for a long time, one quiet moment at a time. That night, in my new space, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence. No footsteps. No voices, just me, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel it fully. The rejection, the loss, the truth, not that my son chose his wife over me, but that I had misunderstood my place. I wasn't being pushed out because I was unloved. I was being pushed out because their life had moved forward and mine had been left standing behind. That was the moment everything truly changed. Not because of what they said, but because of what I finally understood. The first few weeks on my own were quiet in a way I had never known before. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own thoughts whether you want to or not. I woke up early every morning out of habit. There was no one to cook for, no one to wait on. Still, I made breakfast like I always had. Then I realized I was setting 2 plates on the table. I laughed softly at myself and put one away. That small moment stayed with me all day. It showed me how much of my life had been built around someone else. Not in a bad way, just in a way that forgot to leave room for me. In the afternoons, I walked through the neighborhood. I noticed things I never had time to see before. The sound of leaves, children laughing in the distance, the way the light changed as the day slowly ended. These walks became my quiet therapy. No advice, no judgment, just movement and air. Some evenings my phone stayed silent. Other nights my son sent short messages. "Hope you're okay. I've been busy," I replied with care. "Take your time. I'm fine." And I meant it, not because I wasn't hurting, but because I was learning to stop waiting for something that wasn't coming. I began to reflect on the past. Not with anger, but with honesty. I saw how I had given everything without ever asking what I needed. How I believed love meant always stepping back. How I stayed quiet even when something felt wrong. I didn't blame my son, and I didn't blame his wife either. I realized that expectations can become silent burdens if we never speak them out loud. One night, I sat by the window as rain tapped gently against the glass. I thought about all the moments I stayed silent to keep peace, and I understood something important. Silence can protect love. But silence can also hide pain. I wasn't wrong for loving deeply, but I was wrong for forgetting myself in the process. This realization didn't make the pain disappear, but it softened it. Like light slowly entering a dark room, I started doing small things just for me, reading before bed, cooking meals I enjoyed, sitting without guilt. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of healing. I stopped checking my phone every hour, stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped wondering what I could have done differently. Because healing isn't about answers, it's about peace. And slowly, quietly, peace began to find me. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, in quiet moments when I wasn't looking for it. It came when I stopped asking why and started asking how to move forward. One morning, I received a message from my son. He asked if I was eating well, if I was sleeping enough. The words were simple, but they mattered. I didn't rush to reply. I let myself feel what the message brought up. Not anger, not sadness. Just a soft reminder that love doesn't always disappear, sometimes it just changes shape. When I finally replied, I kept it gentle. "I'm taking care of myself." And that was true. Days passed. Weeks too. Life settled into a new rhythm. I realized something important during that time. Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about deciding not to carry the weight anymore. I forgave my son for choosing differently than I expected. I forgave his wife for not understanding my place in their life. And slowly, I forgave myself for expecting others to read my silence. There was no big conversation, no emotional reunion, just understanding. One afternoon, my son visited. He stood at the door unsure like a child again. We didn't talk much. He looked around my small space and said quietly, "You seem calmer." I smiled. "I am." That was all that needed to be said. I didn't explain my pain. I didn't list my sacrifices. Because healing had already done the talking for me, forgiveness gave me freedom, not because others changed, but because I did. I learned that love doesn't always mean being close. Sometimes it means letting go without bitterness. Sometimes it means choosing peace over being right. As the days went on, I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I no longer needed it to be. And in that quiet acceptance, I found something I had been missing for a long time. Myself. Peace did not arrive loudly. It didn't come with answers or apologies. It came quietly, like morning light entering a room that had been dark for a long time. I stopped waiting for things to go back to how they were. I stopped hoping for a version of love that no longer fit my life. And in that letting go, I finally felt steady again. My days became simple. I woke up early. I made my tea slowly. I watched the light change outside my window. There was comfort in routine, in knowing what the day would bring, in not fearing silence anymore. I thought about my life often, not with regret, but with understanding. I realized that every role I had played, mother, caretaker, listener, had shaped me, but none of them defined my worth. I was still whole, still deserving of respect, still allowed to choose peace. Sometimes I missed my son. Sometimes the ache returned unexpectedly, but it no longer controlled me. I learned to sit with my feelings without judgment, to let them come and go, to trust that healing doesn't need an audience. I understood something deeper then. Patience isn't about waiting for others to change. It's about trusting that what is meant to settle in your heart will do so in its own time. I began to feel grateful, not for the pain, but for the strength it revealed in me. The silence that once hurt now felt protective, a place where I could breathe, a space where my thoughts could rest, and in that quiet, I found a calm I had never known before. I no longer asked why things happened the way they did. I learned that some questions are not meant to be answered out loud. They are meant to change us quietly. I trusted that nothing in my life was wasted, not the love I gave, not the patience I showed, not even the pain I carried in silence. Everything shaped me into someone stronger and gentler at the same time. I understood that love does not disappear when it changes form. It becomes quieter, less demanding, more honest. I stopped expecting my son to choose me again. Instead, I chose peace for myself. And that choice felt like freedom. I wished him well, not with bitterness, but with calm acceptance. Because holding on to anger only keeps the wound open. Letting go allows it to heal. I learned that dignity is sometimes found in silence, in stepping back without making noise, in trusting that what is seen by God does not need to be proven to people. There were nights when I sat alone and felt complete. Not lonely, not forgotten, just whole. I had done my part, loved fully, given sincerely. And now, I allowed myself rest. I no longer needed to be chosen to feel valuable. I no longer needed validation to feel seen. My worth was never dependent on anyone's decision. And slowly, peace settled into my life like it had always belonged there. And this is where my story ends tonight. Life doesn't always give us answers right away. Sometimes God asks us to stay patient, stay kind, and stay silent, not because we are weak, but because He sees what others do not. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Maybe someone needed this reminder today. Thank you for listening with an open heart. May God see every silent struggle and replace pain with peace. Until next time, this was Voice of Auntie Universe.